Is it possible to have nostalgia for an era that you weren't even born in? Welcome guys to another Let Me Explain video. So today's topic is, why are the 80s so nostalgic? Here we are in the 2020s and we still have so many references in our society to the 80s, so many cultural footprints that are still relevant today based on what happened in the 1980s, and they very much influence our culture to this day. And those who shape our culture, whether it be entertainment or politics or whatever it may be, they know how nostalgic we are for the 80s, which is why they incorporate it into all these different areas of our everyday lives. I mean, damn, I'm a 90s kid and even I feel nostalgia for the 80s. That's how palatable it is. And we know that this is specific to the 80s because we don't share the same sort of nostalgia for the 60s or the 70s or even the 90s at this point. The 60s and 70s is most likely because those were periods of serious social revolutions and demonstrations, protests. It wasn't the most happiest of times, even though you got the sexual revolution, things like that, people, good vibes and all these sorts of things going around. But ultimately there was a lot of social conflicts going on. Whilst on the other hand, in the 90s, that does feel just a bit too recent to be nostalgic. I think it will get to that point, give it a few years, but as it stands right now, the 80s is really in that sweet spot for us. It's a whole generation removed, meaning that kids who were growing up in the 80s are now the parents and have children the age that they were in the 80s, and so they're kind of reminiscing on their own childhoods, which is most likely during that 80s period. Whilst this explains the situational nostalgia for the 80s, just based on its timing within history and where we are now, I will go into today some 4 particular points that I want to bring up that are more related to the content of the 80s and exactly what took place during that period that also contributes to this extra nostalgia that it brings up in all of our minds. First key point is sense of stability. So looking at this from the American perspective, obviously because America drives a lot of the culture that we experience around the world. What was happening with America in the 1980s? Well, they had a president, Ronald Reagan, who was the president for 8 out of 10 years of the 1980s. And not only was he president, but he was an overwhelmingly popular president during that period, winning both of his elections in absolute landslides. I believe he won one of them, I can't remember which one, where he carried 49 out of the 50 states, which is just unheard of when you think of today's politics. And that's quite similar to President Eisenhower, who was president for 7 out of the 10 years in the 50s. And so there's actually a similar feeling and regard for the 50s. When you look at how people felt about them, particularly in the 80s, they were very nostalgic for the 50s. And that comes back in the consistent thread that they have is that sense of stability with the leadership at the very top. So it just reinforces that idea that if you have stability at the very top, it filters down to the other groups and the lower groups in society, and it makes for overall happiness, generally speaking. Which brings me to my second point, and that second point is positive entertainment. So the 80s was very much an era of patriotism and films having kind of happy endings and happy ever afters, all that sort of stuff. So it was everything was being conveyed in very positive lights, which was very much contrasted against the doom and gloom, particularly of the 70s, where a lot of films had more darker tones and more kind of pessimistic kind of undertones to all their films. And whereas the 80s now, it was all about patriotism, American pride, all these things, and that was all clicking into full gear throughout all their entertainment and their music. And speaking of music, you had these humanitarian songs and initiatives that were throughout the 80s. You had We Are the World, you had Do They Know It's Christmas, and they had Live Aid, the massive concert. So there was just so many like humanitarian initiatives that were going on around the world that I think were really fueled by this sense of pride and this sense of positivity that was permeating throughout the 80s. Number 3 is the rise of nerd culture. So the significance of this is that a lot of the very popular nerdy things that are still popular to this day, such as Star Wars, Dungeons and Dragons and whatnot, they actually got their start in the mid to late 70s, but the effect of them did not really take place and take hold in the culture until the 80s. And that's when they really started to click into gear and started to filter through to the schools and young kids and all these sorts of things, where they were building their own communities and groups around their own nerdy obsessions. And so it created these almost safe spaces for these nerds and people who were geeks and whatnot, who were always felt like kind of like outcasts in society. And whilst they were still kind of operating in these more underground kind of settings and more secret kind of communities, at least they had a group for each other and they weren't isolated or alone anymore. And so there was this, I guess you could say, this sense of optimism amongst this class of people who felt kind of like outcasts in society in terms of what their interests were. And so again, it's just another aspect of society that was just feeling this extra sense of optimism and positivity. And it was thanks to the likes of things that had actually happened starting in the 70s. And you fast forward to today's world and nerddom dominates the mainstream. I mean, it's everywhere. You think about Comic-Cons, you think about the types of films that make the most money, namely superhero films, sci-fi films and whatnot. It's everywhere, and it's no longer a subculture or underground. It's very much on the surface. It's mainstream, it's widely accepted, and they're kind of the cool kids now. And I strongly believe that this is due to the strong positive reinforcement that nerd culture got during the 80s, thanks to the overall positive nature of the era. Fourth and final point that I want to make is a really obvious one, and that is color. I mean, look at these images. They're bursting with color. It's all neon, it's bright, colorful, all of that. That was everywhere in the 80s. Everything was about color. The fashion was ultra vibrant. The music videos had lots of bright colors in them. The design, graphic design, everything you can imagine was just like bursting with color. It wasn't muted. We use a lot of muted colors these days, and they even did something a bit like that before the 80s too, but now, and I feel like we've kind of gone backwards in that regard. But the 80s was bursting with color, man, and that was so cool to look back on. I didn't get to experience it myself, but just to see the imagery of it just feels like a different world almost. Whilst you might consider these colors like kind of tacky and lame and whatnot now, but really they give a sense of positive energy when you look at them. When you see them, you don't, even if you think they're tacky, you can't help but admit that there is a positiveness to them. They make you feel good. They're bombastic, they're over the top, they're all these things, but they're striving for positivity, and they remind us of a world that was much more optimistic, and it's great. I love the color of the 80s. It's absurd, a lot of it, but to me it's great, and it's a tangible evidence of really what the whole decade symbolizes as a whole. Just bright, colorful, positive, optimistic, all of that. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video on the 80s, and hopefully it was a bit of a trip down memory lane for you, a bit of nostalgia for yourselves as well. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts in the comment section below, particularly people who were born or raised in the 80s and got to experience it. What do you think about it? And if you have different opinions, if you think there's certain decades that are actually better than the 80s, I'd love to hear them, or why you think they were more nostalgic in different ways. I want to hear them. I'm open to all ideas. I could be completely wrong about all this, but it's just my interpretation of how I see it. And yeah, I feel like I was born in the wrong decade. I am a 90s kid, but I feel I have the spirit of an 80s kid. And from the music, the movies I watch, everything I'm invested in, all comes back to the 80s. And yeah, I love it. So that's all I got, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a like if you did. And if you're enjoying my content, please subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time. Bye.